Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Ackerman-Leist. I'm the head of editorial at the Lexicon, and we have been working on a project that many of you know, but others perhaps don't, and that's the Ecological Benefits Framework. And so we're very excited today to be launching our EBF Town Hall series. And so here we are in pilot mode and excited about what we have to share today. For those who are joining us who perhaps don't know what the ecological benefits framework is, it's a new paradigm. It provides a foundational architecture to radically transform global carbon and ecological benefits markets, both by increasing transparency, trust, quality, equity, and by accelerating the coordinated delivery of positive financial, environmental, and social impacts. So we're very excited today to be able to jump in with two experts in the question that we're tackling here today. And today's topic, as I think you know, by virtue of registering and joining us, and thank you for joining us both by our webinar here and also by YouTube. And so today's topic is really, can we effectively use practices as a proxy for outcomes? And today's topic really gets to the heart, not just of a critical question that we're debating in the continued development of EBF, but it really also speaks to a core consideration for certifiers, policymakers, and even regulators. And when designing, when designing and launching an ecological benefits initiative or a project of any kind, how is it that we balance the need for impact assessment, that is outcomes, with what is often a pragmatic need to rely upon proven practices? So as we use practices as a proxy for outcomes, it offers scalability while also risking uncertain results and a potential for greenwashing. So we're going to dive into these topics, and we're very fortunate to have two experts today, Ned Horning and Dr. Drea Burbank, and to give you a quick overview of their backgrounds. Ned is the principal scientist at the Regen Network Development. He's also consulting for WWF's Biodiversity Credit Monitoring. He's was director of Applied Biodiversity Informatics at the American Museum of Natural History. He's done private consulting, and he was also senior scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. So Dr. Drea Burbank, who is the CEO of Savimbo, is the founder and co-founder there. And that project, as she'll tell you more about, is helping farmers in the Colombian Amazon sell fair trade credits. Notice we didn't just say carbon credits there. And so she'll certainly help inform us more of what she's doing in that regard. She's also been the project lead, advisor, and researcher for a number of projects focused on improving the human condition and the planet that sustains us all. She was the CEO and founder of To Dream a Life, focusing on hard tech and science. She's also trained as a physician, and she has extensive wildfire fighting experience as a hotshot, which really helps explain exactly why she's here today. So we're very grateful for both of you joining us today, both Drea and Ned. And just maybe to start off and give you the opportunity to provide folks with a little bit of context of your backgrounds, perhaps was there a time, and Drea, we'll start with you here, is there a time in your earlier professional experience that you can recall when you first began to think about when and when it doesn't make sense to use practices as a proxy for outcomes for impact projects?
I mean, I think you always think about it in healthcare. So I had a career in healthcare before I moved into planetary science, and you always think about exercise versus longevity, for instance. So is it worth exercising, whether or not, if you're going to extend your lifespan?
Wow, that's as perfect and succinct as we could have hoped for. So I'm sorry, Ned. Yeah, but how about you, Ned?
Yeah, for me, I think I understood the importance of practices when I was doing research. A lot of the research sometimes seemed to get off the rails and too focused where you couldn't kind of see the forest through the trees. And I think with practices, you do that. And when it really hit me was within the first few days I was working for Regen, I was on a call, and it was something to do with, grazing, carbon credits from grazing. It was soil carbon credits, and they were just talking about all these problems that they were experiencing. Like, there's a lot of uncertainty and the cost of measurement, and are they going to get more back from the credits they're putting into the sampling and this and that. And it just got me thinking, like, this is not the way to be thinking about it. If we know the practice works, why can't we just do it? So that's kind of what got me going down this path.
Great. Well, perfect. Thanks so much. And I do think both of those examples help provide the context for how it is we're grappling with these questions. And perhaps to get into it a little more deeply, I think people joining us, some are very experienced project developers, others have been looking at projects, perhaps from the investment side or from the verification certification side. But I think let's just give an overall understanding of really how a project is designed and how it is that you think about practices and outcomes in that regard. And I think, Drea, perhaps you're going to start with us there and give us some insights into Savimbo and how
Yep.
you tackle this. Great.
So
Thank you.
yeah, we're a strange beast, and I think it's a good case example of what it's like to kind of figure out how to quantify a really complex system. So okay, where can you see my screen okay?
Not quite yet.
Okay, you might have to put it up. I think I'm sure.
Now we can.
Okay, great. So my name is Drea. I'm the founder and CEO of Savimbo. We sell fair trade climate credits, and I'm one of 3 founders, and I'll get into that in a minute. This whole story started because my friend Johnny had a jaguar in his backyard, and he started following it around with the game camera. And he stopped narco trafficking, became a vegetarian and a conservationist. And then he got all of his neighbors together and chased the petroleum and mining companies out of his valley. So we thought Johnny was fascinating. We were like, why did this man do this? There was no mentor for this in his neighborhood. He was kind of one of a kind. And so we studied his behavior to see if it could be scaled and replicated in the area. So we decided that Johnny did it because the jaguar was beautiful. It was wild, and it was bigger than him. And that's the way that I feel about our project, Savimbo, but that's the way that everybody in Savimbo feels about our planet. We protect this patch of Amazon jungle. This is in southern Colombia on the border of the Amazon. It's one of the biggest, about 16% deforestation in some areas of Putumayo, and it closely parallels other problems that exist in the Brazilian and Ecuadorian Amazon with deforestation. We protect it by selling fair trade climate credits. So we sell biodiversity, water, trees planted, we call them tree credits, and carbon credits. All of these products are fair trade, and I'll get into that more in depth. The project was started, our company was started by 3 environmental friends. So we have, and I would like to call us weirdlings because we are just odd, and the oddness works in this case. So Johnny Lopez worked for the World Wildlife Fund as a jaguar tracker for 9 years before he decided to disintermediate them. I'm an MD technologist. I came out of chaos theory and health behavior change, and high-tech serial founder when I met these guys and decided they were my co-founders. And Fernando Lozama is a 3rd-generation Colombian shaman, so we call them Taitas. And he's an indigenous leader and has been doing advocacy in the region for many, many years. I just want to say Johnny and Fernando have been active in this area for 20 years prior to my arrival. What I mostly provided was bridging. So when we're talking about our project, I like to put it in terms of planetary scale. So this is a video from NASA from the year 2021 and showing global emissions in the global north and global absorptions in the global south in the Amazon. And as you watch the emissions, there's a kind of a swirl over the Amazon where it's just sucking the carbon out of the air. If you don't think about the problem at this scale, you're going to be focused on one or the other. You're going to be focused on the Amazon or emissions. And I think the hard reality is we need to do both. But more importantly, forests like the Amazon need support from some of the biggest emitters who are not in their geocode. So hang on just a second. When you're looking at the Amazon, the reason we care about it on a planetary scale is it's one of 5 ecological planetary tipping points. And by that, I mean it stores 25% of the world's land carbon, which it will emit back to the atmosphere on top of our current emissions if we cannot figure out how to stop drying it out, because it will burn and do that for us. When we're looking at where land carbon is stored at on the planet, on a planet-wide scale, it's mostly stored at the equator in nation-state governments that are fairly weak. So the Congo, the Amazon, we work in former FARC territory. These are areas with fairly poor central government control and virtually no resources in order to help preserve them. So like I said, we work in the Colombian Amazon. And if you want to look at deforestation in the Amazon, it seems like it's sort of a homogeneous problem, and you can see that mostly tends to follow roads. And this is the tropical Andean biodiversity hotspot where we work. But in reality, if you look on a micro scale, the deforestation is happening on tiny little plots. And it's usually happening with about 1 billion people that the World Bank calls small farmers. So they generally have a lot of assets, but they have very little resources. They tend to live with minimal money, so almost a cashless society. They're not wired up and they're not well characterized in terms of economics. But these are the guys doing the deforestation, and usually on plots of like half hectare at a time. So in order to stop deforestation, you have to find out how to financially include them in climate markets. Here's Johnny talking about how he was a conservationist for 20 years without getting paid a dollar. And here is Johnny's friends that joined our project. This is 27 men in 27 villages in the area. So when we made Johnny happy, everybody there decided to join the project because it wasn't a problem of willingness, it was a problem of microeconomics. We also work with about 30 indigenous groups currently. We have probably 10 actively affiliated with us, 4 starting projects, and that's in 4 continents and 10 countries now. I just want to say that indigenous groups are actually strongly wired across the Amazon and even across countries. So like our shaman in Colombia calls the shaman in Australia. And so they've got their own LinkedIn. And if you can make one indigenous group happy and do a good job for them, they will oftentimes open the doors for you with other groups. What that means is that our project is a strained mosaic. So we have a lot of small farmers and we have indigenous groups. And Johnny tends to represent the small farmers in the project, and Fernando tends to represent the indigenous groups. And the harmony between the two of them is part of the core of our success. So currently we have 2 sites in the Putumayo Amazon. We have 200 small farmers in Putumayo, and we have about 55 families in Santa Rosa. Collectively, that's about 16,500 hectares under protection, and we grow 10% to 20% month over month. I want to talk a little bit about equity because it's a really core part of why we're successful. So our company is 7% co-owned by anybody who brings land into the project. It's also 7% co-owned by any staff that works on the project. Not always the same people. And then we pay 50% of our proceeds to sites for biodiversity credits at least, sometimes a little bit less for small farmers, and then sometimes a little bit more if they bring a big plot of land. And we only use locals for tracking. So we don't bring in outsiders. We teach locals and we incapacitate them to do their own work. I'll talk briefly in terms of EBF. So it's difficult to quantify the value of a primary forest, and carbon alone certainly does not cut it. So when we talk about our project, we talk in terms of biodiversity. We have one of the most biodiverse regions in the world in our site. We talk about equity in terms of how are we including small farmers? Are we putting them face forward? Are they getting paid directly? And are they being trained and given access to tools so that they can represent themselves well? This is one of our best drone operators, a young mother. And here's 2 of our farmers just going on and on TikTok about how the water and how they've protected it. They have, and it's beautiful. You can drink the water anywhere. So on to water. Like I said, anywhere in our site, you can drink the water. And that's not a small thing. That's a collective effort by hundreds of farmers over time to keep petroleum and mining out of the area. In a neighboring river, it was just had a huge oil spill, and there was hundreds of dolphins killed in the Amazon downriver. And these guys' success is directly proportional to that effort. So water is an incredibly important part of our project because we are at the headwaters of the Amazon. So if our water is contaminated, the entire Amazon downriver is contaminated. And there are active multinational interests at all times trying to contaminate the water. I've been to several meetings with copper companies and mining companies and petroleum companies where they're telling them to get lost. It's not the locals in this case, it's multinationals. So this is just a planetary view of where we're at in the Colombian Amazon and where our site shapes up. Like I said, we're on the edge of a tropical Andean biodiversity hotspot. Last but not least, we've got, I was just talking about the carbon. Last but not least, we've got air. So for air quality, it's really important to us that our farmers start doing organic farming because the insect life where we're at is so diverse and multitudinous. And so we work with them to do agrobiodiversity crops and monitor dragonflies. And then soil, also non-trivial, also hard to quantify soil properly in the jungle. These are agrobiodiversity crops that are grown. Primary jungle produces very, very fertile soil, but it's really hard to get close to laboratory testing. And so we usually have to rely on practices for that. I'm going to drill down on one of our payment layers. So like I said, we have 6 payment layers and we sell 4 climate products. So carbon credits, biodiversity credits, water credits. We also sell agrobiodiversity crops and ecotourism, and then we plant trees. So I just want to talk about the biodiversity and how we've quantified it, because for a while there, all we had was practices like conservation. There's lots of things going on with the project, and obviously not enough time to talk about all of them. We learned 3 things about biodiversity during the course of the project. So the first thing we learned is you don't have to quantify it to conserve. We live in one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. Most of the trees have not been quantified. We have no idea what kind of rare species are on our site. Primary data in the Amazon is oftentimes controlled by public institutions who either won't publish it or won't share it. And so the best data we can find is from the Amazon Tree Biodiversity Network, but we never could get access to the raw data. We honestly have no idea how many trees are on each farmer's land. Johnny identifies them by taste. And so what we realize is that we need a lot of time. Nobody's been in this area because it's former FARC territory for 20 years. And so we need time to quantify it, but we shouldn't stop conserving in order to quantify. Here's the national news podcast about what we thought was a very fat dog or a very ugly bear, but it ended up being one of the most rare species in the Amazon. And Johnny looked back in his videos and he's like, oh yeah, that's a mating pair. They've been here for like 10 years. And so we've been conserving the area for much longer than we knew what was there. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is many of these sites, many of the biodiversity methodologies require extensive quantification, and we simply cannot afford that. We need to stop and conserve it first before we have the time to really figure out what kind of a treasure we're sitting on. The next thing we learned over a year was that 5% of the population owns 80% of the biodiversity. So planet-wide, the majority of biodiversity on our Earth is caretaken, is stewarded by indigenous groups who have actively preserved it at an economic and social loss. And so when we're talking about quantifying and selling biodiversity and doing biodiversity credits, it's absolutely imperative that they are in the room. Because they are the asset owners in this case. And furthermore, they are the ones who know how to preserve it and steward it. If we don't reward them, then we fail to value the people who do the most for our ecology. This is Johnny talking about his forest. So Johnny has a totally different kinesthetic sense of the jungle than I do. I would compare him on naturalist intelligence to Charles Darwin. He's famous in the region for being able to identify any plant, any animal, walk to any tree. And if you look, he's got his hands and he's moving around. He's a very active person and he has a very kinesthetic knowledge of the jungle. And that knowledge is also couched in indigenous languages that are 5,000 years old. So he's very much an expert. But he has no education. And oftentimes I see biologists coming to the region and discounting what he's saying, even though there's no question that he knows more about the area than they do. The last thing I want to say is the science is better if it is simpler. This is not just a matter of, good science not being so overly verbose or wordy. It's a matter of the jungle itself. So if you try and bring eDNA machines in there, they don't last very long. Almost no technology lasts very long in the Amazon. The air just kind of eats it. So we found that game cameras did survive, but based on the people I've talked to, audio recording devices only last for one deployment. So it's very important that we bring in robust technology and we don't make standards around experimental technology that has not proven itself in remote areas. The last thing I want to say on this is that these carbon markets are really struggling right now, especially nature-based, because you can't prove a counterfactual. You can't prove what didn't happen. And even if you can, we know from preventative medicine, people don't want to pay for it. So we know really well from preventative medicine, people don't want to pay for the lung cancer that didn't happen, even when you can prove you did it. And then oftentimes we're working in a complex system where you can't predict the future. And so when you claim that you're going to do something, it's very difficult to meet those targets. 20-year contracts and 100-year contracts are not appropriate with indigenous groups. And complicated science in many cases is simply not necessary, nor is it good science. And I'll just show you a brief example. Most of our statistics are designed for linear relationships. I'm going to get super nerdy. Just give me a second. When we have a nonlinear relationship that's exponential, oftentimes our science fails. We predict things that we shouldn't predict. And when we have a fan-shaped data, that also fails. You kind of need a pretty advanced statistical career to be able to correct for those two types of bad data. When we're looking at natural data, we're much more commonly looking at chaotic or complex systems, and that data looks like this. And when we think that we can predict it, we're simply lying to ourselves. We do not have the capacity or the mathematics or the statistical experience to predict those systems. And so we need to settle for much simpler metrics. This is our biodiversity methodology. Instead of measuring every species in our area, we decided to measure the apex predators and normalize their living range to a circle. What that looks like in code is that this farm, the borders of this farm have been clipped to account for the jaguars that were found in it. The data was unioned, and then we separated it into hectares with intact biodiversity. Just to go over that one more time, in order to do the biodiversity methodology I'm talking about, you would pick your indicator species. Any one of the apex predator or sentinel species, keystone species would qualify. Then you get your data, which would be primary data from a video camera, just like Johnny's jaguar. And then you would calculate your data using code. So that's a much more simpler metric of biodiversity than a lot of people are looking at using. In this methodology, we would not be measuring individuals. We would be doing outcomes-only payments, once again, because future predictions tend to fail. And we would be normalizing to a circle. And most of the indigenous groups we work with are strongly against offsetting. And then everything else is put into code. I think that's about it. I'm happy to answer questions. And I think, and there's a TikTok of our Johnny's cute jaguars and our absolutely adorable staff who are the coolest people on the planet.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Drea. And maybe before we jump to Ned, there is one question here. Are some of the same families working on all 6 of the benefits, or is it typically segmented?
That's a great question. Actually, what we found is the jungle is quite heterogeneous. I've seen other projects that do an ecology credit. And actually, one of the big trading platforms, the biggest spot market in the world, asked me about it last week. And I said, I think the problem with a full ecology credit is that the jungle is quite heterogeneous. So we found 30% of our farmers qualify for carbon, 30% qualify for biodiversity, and 30% qualify for both. So I'm a strong advocate for layering. I think that gives you more flexibility in your data, more accuracy, and it helps your ecology credit, your ecology claims stand up to scrutiny.
Great. Thank you, Drea. And then there is also one more question, and then we will jump to Ned. So why are the 20-year contracts not functional with Indigenous people? Why would that not work, since they're all about the permanence of the forest, rivers, and et cetera?
Yeah, I think I kind of don't understand why you still get that question, but I guess that explains part of the problem. So in most Indigenous cultures, they feel that all of the contracts they've ever signed with a white person have led to genocide and mass extinctions and general land theft. So that's kind of, if you want a historical representation of that belief, then you could read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee or any historical textbook. But our groups haven't been colonized, so they don't have as much historical trauma around that as groups in the US or Canada might, or Australia. But my leaders frequently tell me about massacres that occurred, germ warfare that occurred, so they haven't forgotten at all. They don't think contracts are great. That's more traumatic based. Some of the leaders that we talk to who are super proactive are just brilliant. They're one of the leaders that we talked to was like, hey, he's like, governments change, science changes. He's like, why would we sign a 100-year contract when you just came up with the carbon credits 20 years ago? He's like, we don't want to be signing these long-term contracts until you get your crap sorted out. And he's like, I have to make a decision for not only my children, but my children's children. And I don't feel like this market is stable enough to commit my people and our land to this. And so what happened was a lot of the Indigenous groups simply didn't join the carbon market, even though they should have been rewarded for it. So we're strongly advocating for the biodiversity market. Permanency is a difficult fight in carbon. Like doing a 1-year contract in carbon probably isn't going to work because of the bad acting historically that's gone on. However, with biodiversity, there's no requirement for permanency. And if you're doing outcome-based, then you can kind of think of it like a taxi. So if you pay a taxi driver for a ride, you're not paying him for that car for the rest of his life. You're paying him for one ride, but he's going to take care of the taxi because that's how he makes his money.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, this is fascinating. And I think there's a lot more to dig into here, Drea. And I see some of the questions coming up in the chat that we'll loop back around, toward the end and try to make sure we capture all of those. And but maybe, Ned, let's hear from you with regard to your work at Region Network or perhaps even WWF and how you think about project design and practices and outcomes as you're putting those together.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. And that was wonderful, Drea. It's really inspiring. And I think what I'll be, the way my perspective on this might be slightly different, but I think it's supportive of what you're doing. So with Regen Network, we don't so much develop methodologies, although I will talk about one methodology that I just finished developing. We try to support other people developing methodologies. We're more or less a digital ledger where a lot of these methodologies would be registered and then credits would be generated from that. And I also want to say that the comments I'm making are really my comments, not so much, I don't want to put Regen Network necessarily on the spot. So if I say something that's a little bit too off, I don't want them to suffer anything from this.
Sure.
So what I'll talk about is a methodology that I developed recently, and it was put live a couple weeks ago. So we have some credits for sale on our marketplace. It's the first methodology to create projects that's based on the environmental stewardship methodology, or the environmental stewardship framework, I guess, that I've been working on. And the methodology is grazing sheep in vineyards. And I got started in this when I first joined Regen. There was a project that was already going. It was a USDA and NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant funded project with a group called Fibershed out in Northern California. And they were hoping to generate carbon credits for these vineyard owners using this grazing system, which produces a good bit of carbon. The problem was it wasn't generating enough carbon. Well, one reason is because of the climate in Northern California, and also because the vineyards aren't huge. So, the cost of soil sampling and all that would be higher than the amount they get back in credits. So it just didn't make financial sense. And I came in just about when that realization came about. So I thought, why not just based on the practice? The practice, there have been some researchers, and we've been working very closely with a researcher at UC Davis, University of California, Davis, that has shown that this practice of grazing a lot of sheep in a small area for short periods of time, very high density grazing for short periods, short rotations, is very beneficial to the ecosystem. So if that's true, and we looked at the peer-reviewed literature, there was a lot of evidence backing that up. So why not just support the practice? And that's what we ended up doing. And it has a number of advantages. So one is that instead of focusing on a single metric, like carbon, for example, which it just seems kind of insane to me, we can look at the whole ecosystem in general and look at what are some practices that really have multiple benefits and are supporting the entire cycle. With carbon, we seem to cut the carbon cycle in half. We're only interested in the sequestration and storage, and there's a whole other half of that carbon cycle that's incredibly important for our life. We would not be alive without it. That's the emissions. So within soil, with trees, everything is emitting CO2 and other greenhouse gases, and it's important to embrace that. So what we're trying to do is acknowledge that these systems are incredibly complex, just like Joya was saying, and we want to kind of embrace that. We don't want to synthesize it down to a single index. I see in some of the most of the biodiversity metrics, I would say, they start off by saying how complex biodiversity is, and then at the end they create a number, an index, to represent that biodiversity. And to me, that just seems completely absurd. So anyway, another difference is that we take, with environmental stewardship projects, and especially this sheep grazing one, we're looking at ecosystem function rather than ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are what is the environment or the ecosystem doing for me or for humans, and ecosystem function is really how do we keep these ecosystems going in the way they should be working? How do we keep them going? Another difference is that in carbon credits or a lot of these others, the data is collected the data that's collected determines the price of the credit. And what we're doing is we're saying the price should depend on the practice, but data collection is incredibly important. This is a difference from a lot of practice-based approaches. I think a lot of times when we talk about a practice-based approach, people roll their eyes. And I think a lot of that has to do with some history with USDA, where they had a bunch of practices and people say, well, this hasn't worked. Practices, it was tried, it failed, let's move on and do something different. But the other way to think about practice is that you do the practice, but data collection is important. So with the sheep grazing methodology, we set 15% of the credit sales aside for data collection. And those data are collected and analyzed to improve our knowledge about the relationship between the practice and the outcomes. And that's what's important. And it's got a completely different lens on data collection. If you're collecting data and that's going to be the value of the credit, the chance of people gaming a system is incredibly high. And we can see that from carbon credits. It's just off the charts. So the way you try to do it is, you create some rules and enforcement, and that just doesn't seem to work. If you can reduce the incentives for cheating, then there's going to be less cheating, and then you don't have to worry so much about the rules and enforcement. So with this data collection, we can actually have, in these local communities, for example, you can have the local communities collecting the data, because there is no conflict of interest. Their interest is in understanding that relationship between the practice and the outcomes. So they have an inherent interest in collecting good data, and you can pay them to do that. So that 15% that we're taking off could actually be returned back to communities in some cases. The other idea is that with carbon credits, and I mentioned this already, the carbon credit is based on the how many tons of carbon or CO2 equivalents are stored. With a practice-based approach, at least the sheep grazing, we base the price of the credit on how much was needed. So this idea that, and this is a huge problem, I think, and this is, I don't actually, Philip, you recommended this book called Oneness and the 1% by Vandana Shiva, I think it's the author's name. Right. And she has this quote, I'm just going to read this here. It's, nature shrinks as capital grows. The growth of the market cannot solve the very crisis it creates. And I think that's something that we have to put some thought into, that getting more money isn't going to solve the problem. What we need is enough money. And I think there's too much emphasis on profit. Like, how can we get as much money as possible? Let's just buy a bunch of forest, and we're going to get rich off of this. And if we change that to, we want to transition from this from conventional agriculture to regenerative agriculture. But there are costs in that, and over several years, we're going to have to figure out a way to cover those costs. So why don't we just work on a plan to cover those costs? And once at some point, the support they're going to need is going to be minimal or maybe nothing. But if you're focusing on just addressing, getting enough money to the people that need it, I think that's a much better approach than just let's get as much money as possible to these people, or in often cases to other people, to investors and things like that. So anyway, this sheep grazing credit, I think, we're hoping that it's certainly imperfect. And again, going to Drea's idea of keeping short contract periods, that's what right now the first version is just 1 year, because there are going to be some issues. They're going to be, someone's going to flag something like this isn't working. So then we want to correct it. And the idea is that we can correct it. We're collecting data. We're better understanding this relationship between the practice and the outcomes. So we'll collect data and modify the methodology if we need to. So I'm sorry if I'm kind of rambling on here. I get a little excited about this, but I think I'll bring this to a close. And if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them.
No, we like the fact that we can all be nerdy about this here for a given period of time. Yes, ultimately it really is at the heart of so much of what it is that we're trying to figure out with EBF and elsewhere. And, so part of what I'm hearing, I think, from both of you, and correct me if I'm wrong, really is that, there are different things that tend to constrain us, that push us toward using practices as a proxy for outcomes sometimes. So it might be project scale, it might be scope, might be complexity, although that's an interesting conversation we're having, maybe the available technological resources, or the human capacity, or the financial resources. I wonder if there's perhaps one of those that stands out for each of you as sort of the most likely driver for pushing you more toward practices as a proxy for outcomes. Or Drea, if you want to take even more of a purist approach, that's great too. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I am a purist. Well, I think, so coming from medicine, is really kind of a win, because you can take a lot, like several hundred years of Western medical, which was in a complex system, and apply it to planetary science. So it's in many ways, the planet is a fractal of the human body. And when you look at planetary cycles and measuring planetary issues, you can kind of think about it in terms of biogeochemistry. So Earth is an organism. And that's where people coming from earth and environmental sciences or medicine or organic chemistry can add value, because we know lessons learned from other disciplines. That's a long-winded way to say, you don't try and measure everything. And you sure as heck make sure that what you measure is good, because if you measure something wrong, then you're deluding yourself. And in a planet, you can't afford that kind of outcome. Like if we are bad at medicine, we're going to kill one person usually. Maybe a few 100,000 if we produce the wrong product or drug. But if we're bad at a planet, we're going to kill everything. And so we need to really we need to be realistic about what we can measure on a planet scale, and then also be really rigorous about what we're measuring and if are we doing it accurately, so we're not misrepresenting what we've done.
Excellent. And Ed, thoughts there, just in terms of particular constraining factor that seems to jump out as you look at all the regen network projects?
Well, I mean, you could spend a whole webinar just on that topic. I mean, for me, recently at least, I've been couching things in complexity, and the need to kind of be able to acknowledge complexity and leverage that to the maximum amount possible, because I think simplifying it is going to be a problem. Yeah, I think I'm just going to stop there for now. Unless there's some, can I say a little bit about the outcomes in the vineyards? So in the grazing methodology, the outcomes that people are seeing one is increased carbon. So there is carbon sequestration going on. It's just not enough to warrant going into the carbon markets. And I will also say that the one pilot that we've run, a pilot project that we ran, wanted absolutely nothing to do with carbon markets. So they almost decided not to work with us because they thought this was going to be an offset carbon market kind of project. And when they realized what it was, they were just so enthusiastic. So one of the outcomes is carbon sequestration. Another is improved soil quality, and mostly having to do with water holding capacity. That's something that's very important in Northern California. When they get rains, and this is one of the vineyard owners that has been doing this regenerative practice for a few years now, said they had this incredible rainstorm. His neighboring vineyard lost a lot of soil. Their soil was intact. They're also found that they're using less water because the water holding capacity is better. So there's a better reservoir within the soil. You don't need to rely on irrigation as much. They're also reducing amendments. So a lot of the fertilizers and pesticides and things like that, because when they're doing this grazing, part of this grazing process is planting forage for the sheep, and it's a mixed cover crop. So it's got all different kinds of plants in there, and it's beneficial for the pollinators. It's beneficial also even for the grapevines themselves because of some of the chemistry that's going. Well, it's biology, but the biology causes chemistry to help feed some of the vines and things like that. So it's just again, we're able to embrace complexity by creating these complex systems and realize multidimensional benefits instead of just focusing on how can we increase carbon.
And then perhaps you could address the second part of this question that Matt Schaefer has that sort of goes along these lines. I think we got to the first, just thinking about balancing the inherent uncertainty within a practice-based methodology with the certainty of the negative impact on the other side of the equation. It's a great question.
Yeah, I look at the uncertainty with the practice base a little bit differently. So it's the reason why we're collecting data is to better understand that relationship. And if we're collecting data and we realize that it's not a positive relationship, that the practice is not producing positive outcomes, then that practice should be changed. But part of that is that, if that's happening in a carbon market or an outcome-based system, the people doing those experiments and trying these, potentially very powerful regenerative practices, if they're not, getting enough money, they're effectively being punished. And just because something's not working doesn't mean that these people are bad and they should be punished for it. If they're trying something and they're helping us learn something, they should be rewarded for that as well. So even if they're not getting the outcomes they're aiming for, they should still be getting funding for that because they're helping us learn more about it. So they're helping us advance that science. So I look at the uncertainty in that a little bit. As far as the markets go, that's the big question mark for me. Right now, most of the markets for this one, it's the fiber industry or the groups that we're targeting. What I would like to see is more of a kind of regional or bioregional market developed on the local scale, because I think a lot of people will be wanting, individuals will be wanting to support this. That's really difficult when your credits are on the blockchain, though. Regen is it's a blockchain ledger-based system. And the onboarding, going from fiat to crypto and back, crypto back to fiat is still an extremely difficult process for a lot of people. So that's one of the problems. But I think cracking that market, the market issue is going to be huge, and I don't have the answers for it right now. My feeling is that if we're going to try to get complexity down to a single number, let's work with the economists or the people, the financial people, and have them look at all these different practices, and then they can figure out which ones are most important for specific companies and things like that. So I would rather see, if we're going to be trying to do simplifying complexity, let it go that direction and not in the direction that it's going now, where we want to simplify the index so it's really easy for the investors. I don't think that's the way to do it. Let's make it, let's put some of the burden back on the investors. Most of this work in payment for ecosystem services is driven by investors, and that's a problem. I think the investors need to, develop some algorithms and some models and this and that they can look at some of these practices and thousands of these different practices types, practice-based projects, and make some assessments to say, for your company, with your interests and this and that, these would be the ones that do it. And that's something that I think EBF is working on, and that's kind of what I see as one of the biggest things with EBF is simplifying a complex landscape of different projects so investors can support the ones that they think the ones that are most important for them.
I want to address a little bit how we solved the practice outcome problem with our indigenous groups. So what we wanted them to come into the market and do biodiversity credit tracking. They were really good at finding jaguars, but not so great with the video camera loading the data. And so what we did was we paid them to go out and we paid them a small salary to go out and just place the cameras and do the tracking and play with it. And we use the word play a lot. We're like, go play with it, experiment, have some fun, figure out how to do this on your own. And so, and then once they started getting the videos back of the jaguars, then we have an outcome. We can sell that outcome, and that outcome is a good proxy metric for the ecosystem. So I think what we need to do that on a larger scale with projects. We need to give projects a little bit of money, not a lot necessarily, to go and play and figure stuff out. And then we need to give them a bigger reward for an outcome that fits. But without both, you're not going to have a good project. And we did that just to speed it up. What that did was it made it so much faster for a group to adopt tracking.
It's a fascinating approach. And so both Dre and Ned, I'm curious here. I mean, one of the things we're thinking about with EBF, obviously with the 6 benefits with air, water, soil, biodiversity, equity, and carbon, we're trying to be as holistic as we can with those. But at the same time, I want to ask a question that perhaps is a little bit contradictory in that realm. Are there certain among those benefits that seem to be particularly hard to get at in terms of outcomes as opposed to others that we need to be thinking about in this regard with practices as a proxy for outcomes? Do any of them stand out as particularly complex?
And then let Ned close it because he sees a lot wider variety than I do. I can talk about one site. I have a really hard time getting to a laboratory from the Colombian Amazon. So all of the soil stuff that we could be doing, I just simply can't do. And then their air quality monitoring, same thing. So even the water laboratory testing might be impossible for us right now. So I think you can really, you can have a problem with remote projects or projects that have low resources, excluding them unnecessarily when you require a high level of technology because they just can't do it. Ned, what are you saying?
I think all of those are complex. So you could say carbon is easy because it's just one thing. So that's measuring one thing should be easy. But I think when we're talking about carbon, what we really want to be thinking about are greenhouse gases or climate change impact. And carbon is not. I mean, once you look at that, then it becomes incredibly complex. But even measuring carbon, I think a lot of the thinking, a lot of the work that people do is they look at the research. And they say, oh, look, these people have done it. And then they go and put that into a production environment. And I think those are two separate things. There's research grade data collection. There's also production grade. And we're trying to get research grade results using production grade techniques. So I look at it as the state of the art and state of the practice. If we're going to be doing measurements on massive scales, it's state of the practice. You can't be using state of the art necessarily for that type of thing. It just isn't going to work. There are researchers that, they'll come up with great results, but they also, have $1 million budgets, and they've got, unlimited supply of underpaid graduate students and things like that. So I think, it's a very different thing than trying to do something on the lowest budget possible, as fast as possible, with short frequency, and still get good results. So I think it again boils down to this complexity. All those things that you mentioned are part of complex systems, and I think it's important to understand them, but it's good to understand them from a research perspective. So, take the the outcome-based measurements to assign, for credits out of the picture. If you want to understand it better, then think of it, try to think of it in a research thing that's funded through other means.
Yeah, I want to address a little bit about what you're saying about complex systems, because when we were doing health behavior change and using complexity theory and health behavior change, we set an outcome we wanted to reach, and then we iterated our methods until we hit the outcome. And a lot of research studies and a lot of what we're doing right now in climate markets is saying, this is the outcome we want to reach. This is the method that's going to get us there. And then you're stuck with that method. And 20 years later, you realize, oh, that method didn't work. And we're not letting people get creative enough with their methodology to reach an outcome. Now, I realize that that's kind of like contrary to the topic of this meeting, but I think that we need to be more fluid about our practices. If a practice is known to work, fine, do it. But if a practice is not known to work and there's an outcome we're trying to hit, then we need to be a lot more fluid about our practices. And right now, I think you could argue that we still don't know how to reduce carbon. We're not doing a very good job.
All right, sorry, Philip just fell off, but I want to address Sev's question here. So hopefully you can see it on the screen. What do you think about practice-based credits with additionality rights or convertibility, or things that claim to outcome credits?
Ned, you want to talk about that one, or you want me to?
I can start. Yeah, I know it's a kind of a growing interest, and let the market decide, I suppose. I think in my mindset, I think most of the people that are going to be doing environmental stewardship will have this idea that I'm just looking to enough money to do something, to do a specific practice that's going to have some outcomes, and they're not so interested in kind of the larger markets and trying to get as much money as they possibly can. I think having that as an option, if that should be fine. I mean, and I also want to mention that I think I'm not trying to go against other methodologies. I think this kind of environmental stewardship framework that I'm working on is an alternative to a lot of other things, but I think we still don't know what's the best approach. I think we want to have a pretty good variety of different options out there to see what works.
Yeah, our Indigenous leaders told us last night. So there's 30 of them in a panel, and we were talking about rights, and they were like, "Well, we have the right to disagree, and we have the right to have our own beliefs, and that's associated with with the ecology." They say we want biodiversity of beliefs, and so I feel like we kind of need that a little bit right now. We need that creative mindset, the creative play, to get people to figure out what's going to work. Once we figure it out, we can double down on it. But right now, if we say we know what we're doing, we'd be lying to ourselves.
Always appreciate your honesty. Yeah. Well, Drea and Ned, as we're getting close to the top of the hour and needing to wrap up here, I wanted to make sure we address one question, and perhaps this helps us as we go out. What are the warning signs for knowing when practices as a proxy for outcomes aren't going to work? Are there certain things we need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this right now. Like our CO2 levels are still rising despite 20 years of a carbon market. So we have a good outcome metric that we want to be tracking. It is 100% unequivocally telling us our practices are not sufficient. We should not be naive about reality. So yes, if you don't have a good way to measure your outcome, maybe you can measure your practice in the interim. But when you have a good outcome metric and you're not getting there, you need to get radical about swapping that practice out. So I think we need to get radical about swapping out our practices in the near-term future.
Thank you. Ned?
Yeah, I guess I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but I don't view it as practices as a proxy for outcomes. I think practices are a way to get to outcomes. And I think the measurement of the outcomes is important. I think it's critical. I just don't think the dollar value should be assigned to that. I think the dollar value should be assigned to what does it take to get something done, rather than putting the dollar sign on a credit that's like how many tons of carbon or how many liters of clean water or something like that. I think measuring outcomes is important, but practices are probably, in my mind, the best way to get to those outcomes, to get positive outcomes. And I think over time with measurements, I think we will see that. I think. I don't know. I was going to get into kind of offsetting and things like that, but I don't think we want to get into that just yet, or in this call, at least.
I would like to address synergistic benefits. So I'll give you an example. Biochar. Biochar, has a clear financial use case in carbon reduction, but the reality is it can help so many other things. It can help fertilizer. It can help with equity. It can help with eradication of species. I've seen it applied water filtration. It better in building construction. You name it, it's great. And so I think one of the things that we oftentimes miss is that we started to focus on one outcome from a practice, just simply because we can't qualify the other outcomes that are beneficial. But good practices usually are multidimensional beneficial outcomes. So, and we should be looking for stuff like that more often.
Excellent.
And just to follow up,
go ahead. Yeah,
just to follow up on that, another case similar to that is, I just recently saw a paper on methane and how it's been going up, and it's something that people seem to be not paying enough attention to. And there are these ideas with like wetlands, for example. Is it a case where it's sequestering a lot of carbon, but it probably has a net negative impact on the climate because of the methane emissions? Wetlands are emitting a lot of methane. So is that a bad thing? I mean, I think we need more wetlands and not fewer wetlands. But if you look at it purely from like a global warming standpoint, wetlands are not so good. Same thing with mangroves. There are a lot of mangrove areas, and some of the mangrove restoration projects that are getting carbon credits because they suck in a lot of carbon, but they also emit a lot of methane, which ends up having a net negative impact on global warming. So does that mean maybe we don't want to be doing mangrove restoration? No, mangroves are critically important for so many different reasons. Again, when you boil it down to CO2, that's everything goes away. All that complexity is reduced to a number, which is just insane. So I think, again, we need to look at the big picture and address the problems with that in mind. Embrace the complexity and let's keep things going, I guess.
Yeah. Which is exactly how this whole EBF initiative really rolled out, was just born out of the concern of the focus on CO2 and not all of these other pieces. So that really is perfect as we wrap up here. Ned and Drea, thank you so much for your time. I think for folks who may have joined us who are outside of the EBF Activator and have contributed to thinking about where we are right now, we've got a second sprint coming. We're moving forward. These are the kinds of questions that we still have to hash out even further, obviously. But I think you all have helped us lay out a lot of great groundwork here that we need to address as we go a little bit further down the road. So thank everyone for joining us here for this EBF Town Hall. There will be another one next week, and you can see here on the screen that we'll be diving into several different topics that have this kind of really fun, if you want to call it nerdy complexity. Drea, we can go there. These are the things that matter.
Definitely catch up on the nerd level. So I'm worried about the audience if their eyes were crossing, but yeah. Appreciate the nerd love, guys.
Well, it's the nuance and the nerdiness in some of these questions that really help us move forward. So we got to dial in.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you both, and we'll look forward, hopefully, to seeing other folks at the same time next week as we dive into low tech and high tech, looking at MRV, that is measurement, recording, and verification for rigor and equity. So we'll continue some of this conversation as we dive into that. So hope we'll see all of you again next week. Thanks so much, Ned and Drea, for your time today. Best wishes to all as we continue our collective work together.
All right.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.